One of the things that's gratified me a great deal in the last while is to come to give talks and to run into students that I've taught over the years. And I remember a lot of them, if not all of them still. But also to see, my friends in Heritage. And Doug has been my friend in Heritage now for quite a long time. And as you know, Doug does everything well, including organization. And I want to thank him for making me a part of the series and getting to be the opener and the closer. I'm kind of a Romano, well, maybe not Jordan Romano, because I'm not sure how well he's closing lately. But anyway, I'm constrained. When we published this book, we tried to convince the press that we could sell some of these books to the general audience on Prince Edward Island. I think I said we could probably sell 200 or 300 books here. So now I feel constrained to advertise the book whenever I give a talk, to try to encourage people to buy it so I don't look like a liar. Is my mic still working?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, so Alan McCachran is my silent co-author of this talk. He doesn't know it. He's back at Western, but he was at the cottage down on the Argyll shore not so long ago in New Argyll. And a brilliant historian, by the way, and a fine islander, and maybe some summer you'll have a chance to bring him here as one of your speakers. He's currently doing a really fabulous book on the diary kept by the family who lived at Green Gables House. And I think that's going to be published by McGill-Queen's Press, probably available next year, so keep your eye out for it. I've read the manuscript and it's absolutely fascinating. All right. So my screen's telling me that you're looking at the next slide, but there it is. So this is a talk, and Matt McRae, who we also need to acknowledge because Matt's done some excellent work on the centennial, on the celebration of our role as the birthplace of Confederation. I want to take the story back, and I want to take the story forward. Because there's nothing inevitable about either our being the birthplace of Confederation in the popular imagination, and nothing inevitable that it would become a major theme in our tourism industry. So that always intrigues me. What happened, why did it happen, and why should we care? The three questions of history. So you may recognize, oh, by the way, Enshrined. Anyway, there's a kind of a visual joke there. If you don't notice them, I'm going to point them out because I spent a long time on the slides, and I kind of want people to notice them. So here we are at, just for those of you under the age of 50, you probably don't know what it looks like in Province House because it's been under wraps for such a long time. But here is an illustration from 1864 of the Colonial Building. And this is where it all began. Because in Charlottetown, in September 1864, there was a conference at which the delegates of 4 of the colonies in British America agreed in principle to a confederation of the colonies if satisfactory terms could be reached. They did not agree to Confederation's terms. They did not create the Dominion of Canada. But this is a watershed moment in the history of the Confederation story, when what had been an idle debating topic, something brought up in letters and speeches at banquets, became a serious proposition, agreement in principle. Now I emphasize this because I was out on Great George Street 2 weeks ago on my way to lunch with someone, and someone was doing a walking tour, dressed up like a town crier. So, naturally, being a historian, I stopped to listen. And he said, yeah, so this is Province House, and it's called the Cradle of Confederation, but I don't really think that it is, because nothing happened there. They just agreed to have another meeting. I didn't want to take the bread out of his mouth, but I was tempted to introduce myself and say, actually, that's wrong.
You've moved the header slide there.
Oh.
The computer has moved you.
I think there's some subtleness here about trying to keep me on target. even at the time, there was some thought that this might be a momentous event. Look at one of our delegates. Okay, he wasn't a delegate at Charlottetown. He was a delegate added to Quebec. But he was at the banquet that everyone likes to talk about. And he said, you know, it might be remembered. This never was such an important meeting as this held before in the history of British North America. And it may be said that here in little Prince Edward Island was that union formed, which has produced one of the greatest nations on the face of God's earth. A bit of a prophet. Front row? It's okay, Catherine, you don't have to speak. No, it jumped. But here we go. No. I think it just doesn't want us to.
Are you using the buttons?
I am. It should, perhaps I shouldn't be.
Try the mouse, perhaps.
All right.
I'm not sure.
Here we are.
I'm reminded I was at a conference in Quebec once on world, I think it was heritage sites, it was the major world heritage sites. And there was a speaker from Egypt who had a flunky doing the slideshow, and the slides were all wrong. Every single slide was the wrong slide. And the speaker would talk about some landmark in Cairo, and it would be the pyramids. Anyway, I had to leave. So if any of you have to excuse yourself to go outside and laugh, I'm okay with that. Anyway, guess what the Fathers of Confederation did on their day off? Guess, because they did have a day off. Some of them did go to the circus.
North Shore.
They went to the North Shore. They went for a buggy ride to the North Shore. They played tourist. But aside from doing that, they created the general agreement and the basis for a tourist attraction of the Cradle of Confederation. So, now, some of you might, like the comedian now deceased whose name we don't remember, say, nay, nay, nay. Because how can we be the birthplace of Confederation when Prince Edward Island did not, in fact, join Confederation in 1867 when it finally came about? By 1865, we had overwhelmingly rejected Confederation. And if you want to know why and how we changed our mind, you should have been here 6 weeks ago, because that was the talk then. But we said no. In fact, it was commonly said that out of every 100 islanders, 99 of them were opposed to Confederation. This isn't actually a cartoon from the period. I did kind of create that. And yes, the circus, I don't know if I talked about this last time, but I was disappointed to find out there were no elephants in the circus. But there were monkeys and trained horses and dogs. And the monkeys were very naughty. So, 1864, the Charlottetown Conference. 1867, the Dominion of Canada is formed. 1873, Prince Edward Island joins Confederation. In the 1880s, the Government of Canada commissions a painting, a portrait, that is reproduced on the stamp by an artist who actually was in the orchestra at the banquet at the Charlottetown Conference, Robert Harris. But no one is talking about Fathers of Confederation. No one is talking about birthplace of Confederation. There is a tourism industry beginning to develop on Prince Edward Island, and it's built around the seaside and the therapeutic effects of salt air called ozone at the time, and sea bathing, and the relaxing pastoral, kind of countryside that we had. But Confederation is not a tourist attraction. In fact, no one is talking about us being the cradle of Confederation until 1914. I've altered the stamp. The 50th anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference, when all of a sudden PEI discovers we are the cradle of Confederation. and they discover it for touristic reasons. Because the tourism industry is still finding its themes, it's trying to find its major tropes. It's also trying to find itself in a marketing sense. So, at a meeting at the end of 1913, a huge meeting involving all the important people. I want to go back to this slide. Now it won't go at all. Let's try this again. You see that? You didn't quite see? Well, it's not important. It's a photograph of the front page of The Guardian talking about this major meeting involving the lieutenant governor, the mayor, the premier, the former premier, judges, merchants, lawyers, also important people. Sorry. I have friends who are lawyers. About having a major celebration to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference. And in fact, turning it into a tourist event. It was not going to be held in September, which would be the anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference. It was going to be held in August because that's the tourist season. Then and now. And these are just some of the comments that appeared in The Guardian on the date that refuses to show you. What could be more appropriate than the Jubilee celebration of this historic event where the first sod was turned? Hundreds of thousands would come if the matter was properly advertised. Now this, in the tourism industry, was annually attracting less than 10,000 people a year in Prince Edward Island. If we represented it properly. So they also were looking for federal funding. So you think maybe that's just a recent thing. I asked my students, said, so if you have a project in PEI, if you have something you think that needs to be done, what's the first thing that you do? And none of them know the first thing you do in PEI, see whether you can get a government grant for it. Anyway, the celebration will be of national importance. The premier also had been feuding with Ottawa, but the Conservatives have gotten in power in Ottawa, and they had upped the subsidy to PEI, and they had decided to build this ferry. So at this point, we were in snuggles with Ottawa. And it's taunting me because it's showing me the slide with the front page of the Guardian. Anyway.
Oh.
We even created a promotional stamp, which I show because this is possibly the worst drawn map ever of Prince Edward Island. It was drawn by a guy from Summerside. This is not a criticism of the artistic pretensions of people in Summerside. Federal government anteed up $20,000 to help us celebrate. Local people created space in their homes. The national track and field competition was going to be held in Charlottetown. It was hosted by the Adequate Amateur Athletic Association. And it was all going to happen in August 1914, and then something happened. World War I broke out. So, Carter, now we're 2 slides ahead. There we go. So inside the newspaper, there's an ad for all the stuff you need to buy for the celebration. Meanwhile, on page 1, saying Confederation celebration postponed. None of it happened. Very disappointing in a touristic sense.
Did you have to give the 20,000 back?
I don't know whether they did or not, because there is one tangible outcome, if the slide will show it, and that is a plaque. Yes, a plaque. Designed by the same guy who designed the Boer War Monument and the War Memorial in Malpeque, as it turns out. His name was Hamilton McCarthy, and he designed this plaque. I don't know, have you ever seen this plaque? It's in Province House. we wanted to borrow it for the exhibit on tourism last year. So I asked them at Parks, so where's the plaque? Can we borrow it? And they went, it was too heavy to move, so it's actually still in Providence House, so you can't have it. Anyway, take a close look at it. John A. Macdonald is on there, and he's looking pretty cut. He's dressed in a toga, showing a lot of rippling muscle. It's not really a very good plaque, but it did give us, Providence being their guide, they built it better than they knew, which was a pretty quotable statement.
Cut down a couple of trees to do the building. In the middle there, there's only one camp.
There are three trunks there. Yeah. Well, I think he kind of fudged it, to be honest with you. So even though 1914 was a dud, the 50th anniversary was a dud, by the 1920s, the idea that Province House is the cradle of Confederation, which I actually like better because it's alliterative, cradle of Confederation. And by the 1920s, we have a permanent tourism association on Prince Edward Island for the first time. And so there's more of a consistency in marketing. So by the 1920s, well, tourism is still not really very developed. The durable tourism themes have been established. So there's saltwater, sea breezes. No one anymore thinks that ozone will cure ailments, but they do think it's healthy. The countryside, the pastoral landscape, is now closely associated with the people who created the pastoral landscape. That there's this pastoral culture of people rooted in the landscape that had been there for generations, who upheld traditional values of hard work, frugality, honesty, integrity. This was a rural world that urban America had left or were leaving, and yet still longed for, and they felt they could find it on Prince Edward Island. There is the whole idea of islandness. Islands are different. And you know they're different because no place but on an island is there a greater sense of here and there, us and them. The boundedness of an island means you know the boundaries. And islands are different. And I was asking people the other week, who of us has stood on the shore and seen an island off on the water and not felt the urge to go there? So being an island is an attraction, as long as it's not too hard to get here, which is the subject of another talk and another article that I've been involved with Alan McCachran. So escape to an island across water. By the 1920s, this pastoral landscape theme is also being kind of enhanced by the fact that the island has become a literary shrine. Anne of Green Gables took the world by storm. It was published in 1908. Within 5 years, people are showing up in Cavendish looking for Anne Land. And I would argue that the Prince Edward Island in her novels, the Montgomery novels, is in fact a character in her books. And that island she captures so beautifully is an attraction. Not just, let's go to see where Montgomery was from, but they're looking for the island that she recreates in her books. An island, by the way, which is frozen in time, in whenever the novels are set, which is late 1800s, early part of the 1900s. And last, and yes, least, the island is cradle of Confederation. Now, how do you make that into something more important, something more significant? Luckily, a sociologist has studied this very thing. Dean McCannell, if I can get his slide to come up. I do like that slide, but that's not the one I'm looking for. That's kind of a Who's Your Daddy? A process called site sacralization. How do you make some mundane, everyday, ordinary place into something special? How do you make it into a sacred site? And he identified a process. First of all, you have to mark it and identify it. You have to put a sign up saying, on this site, Something important happened, something unique happened, something special happened, which I've translated. He's in kind of a jargonizer, so I've translated it into English. Hey, this is important, or beautiful, or scary, or unique, or whatever. Then you market the site. So you've marked it, put a fence around it, put a walkway up to it, and then you advertise it and you say, hey, come see this site. This place is important. Here's how you get here. And then once they get there, you interpret the site. And you tell them, hey, you came here, here's why it's important. Here's what you should know about the Charlottetown Conference. For example, that it's not true that nothing happened here. There was another meeting, that's all they agreed to. This is where there was agreement in principle to Confederation if satisfactory terms could be reached, the single most important step in Confederation if you're from Prince Edward Island. Then you have mechanical reproduction. Hey, buy the t-shirt, buy the model of Province House, buy one of those funky stovepipe hats, buy the bookends that have the reproduction of the Smiling Father from 1973. So mechanical reproduction. And then social reproduction. So there's a sacred site, and then the society around it starts marketing itself in terms of this nearby important site. So it starts creeping out into the society. All of this, multiple choice question at the end of the talk, all of this is borne out by the rest of the talk. Okay, so we're saying we are the cradle of Confederation, but there are other contestants, there are claimants. Although it's much more recent, someone has said Fredericton is the cradle of Confederation because it was the governor there who decided there should be a conference to talk about maritime union. And he set in motion what became the Charlottetown Conference. Well, I don't think so. There is Charlottetown, where there is agreement in principle, but others will say, well, what about the conference in Quebec in October 1864, where the 72 resolutions were passed, which actually provided the blueprint for the B&A Act? Well, Quebec would have a pretty good claim to be the birthplace of Confederation, except Quebec does not want to be the birthplace of Confederation. They're not even sure they want to be in Confederation. So luckily for us, they're not competing. And other people have said, well, London is where the B&A Act was actually passed in the Parliament of London. Well, London's got lots of things to brag about. This is pretty far down their list. Oh, by the way, Canada started here. It's not up there with, Trafalgar or the Normandy conquest. Anyway, so this cartoon is from the 1870s, by the way, and it's people arguing who's responsible for Confederation. John A. going, don't it recognize its real daddy? So here is one of the first conscious marketing attempts, if you will, to make Charlottetown the cradle of Confederation. It is a film made by the forerunner of the NFB in 1925, and they called it The Cradle of Confederation. You can watch that film online, by the way, and it is absolutely fascinating. It's a silent movie. They come off the train, and it's women empowering themselves. Two women are visiting, they're met by a woman, she drives them around in a sporty car, and they go out to Old Home Week, the second ever one. It hasn't been around since 1888, although that's what they're just advertising the other day on the radio. The provincial exhibition's been around since 1888. In 1925, there had been 3 Old Home Weeks, one in Summerside, one in Charlottetown in 1905, and one in Charlottetown in 1925. Don't get me started on that. And they go to a tourist resort at Beach Grove, and they stay at Fairholme, which is, I guess, sort of like, it's supposed to be a B&B, I don't know. Anyway, the highlight of the film, the climax of the film, Climax of the film. The climax of the film is their visit to what is going to become known as the Room of Destiny. The Confederation Chamber, which until recently had been used as a storage room, because there was no longer a legislative council who met in the legislative chamber, so it had been used for storage. Now they were beginning to chart it up as the birthplace of Confederation, and that's where the plaque was for many, many years. And there they are in the cloche hats, admiring the Hamilton McCarthy plaque. And there's the chamber as it looked in the 1930s. I know what you're thinking. Really doesn't look very special, does it? It's like, yep, it's a room. But that's why it's important to dress up, to make something seem important. You have to make it seem important. So in 1939, we tried again. The 75th anniversary of the Charlottetown Conference, the Tourism Association, in alliance with the province, launched a campaign to get funding from Ottawa for a national celebration of, sorry, I'm looking at my screen. There we go. It even made a special edition of the Atlantic Advocate, the Maritime Advocate at that time. And again, it's the Room of Destiny. Now, I know what you're thinking. 1914, going to have a big celebration, World War I starts. 1939, big celebration, World War II starts. No, we got it in just under the wire. Matt McRae, our speaker last week, has done a great article on this in the Acadiensis, and we draw upon it in our tourism book. It involves a lot of local citizens. Ottawa does give us a grant, but they're loath to give us a grant for an event which they see as a kind of local event. So the rationalization that they make in cabinet is that in order for tourists to come to Prince Edward Island, they're going to have to drive through Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec, and thus they will get a spin-off effect of tourism. Therefore, it's worthwhile to promote this event on Prince Edward Island. And we said, whatever works for you. The highlight was an elaborate tableau called The Romance of Canada, which had about 8,000 people attend. I think it was held at the driving park. And we invited everybody and their dog, the Prime Minister, he didn't come, but 5 of the cabinet ministers, 4 premiers, a few MPs and senators. We didn't do badly. And all of that is reifying it's affirming the status of this is important. Why is it important? Because they're having the pageant of Canada, or the Romance of Canada. Well, why are they having the Romance of Canada? Because it's important. It's a circular argument, but it builds momentum. D.C. Harvey, the historian from just down the road, judged it one of the most significant events in our history. He was a speaker at the event. He said, how come it's not being held in September? And they said, because it's out of the tourism season. And we went, oh, okay. There was a parade, and a friend of mine inherited a photo album by a lady who took photographs of the parade. And so she had photographs of all of the floats, and I've taken most of them out. I'm just going to show you a couple. It's like Old Home Week parade, except drawn by horses. This is the PEI float. Egregiously politically inappropriate today. There's Jacques Cartier discovering PEI, and here are Aboriginal worshipful sidemen who are actually local people dressed in brown face, not local Mi'kmaq. The Ontario float.
Did they come from Ontario? These people?
No, they're not real Ontarians. Actually, that's, yeah, there we go. But to my mind, there's also newsreel footage of this, which you can find online. And again, it's absolutely fascinating. One of the highlights was they unveiled it's historic Sites and Monuments Board, plaques to the fathers from PEI, which were unveiled at Province House. And they got the descendants of the fathers from PEI to unveil them. And the eldest of the descendants was the daughter of John Hamilton Gray, who is still alive. And she is so at home in front of the camera. You'd think she had a cell phone. She's just completely not self-conscious, and she does a great job. And it's a great success, and it begins the process of entrenching with both Islanders and Canadians the idea that this is the birthplace of Canada, or Confederation, and that's important. Now, can anybody guess, well, I get a drink of water, can anybody guess what that excavation site is? You should get a right answer for that. It's not, but it should be.
The Dominion Building.
It is the Dominion Building, where I currently live. Built on a block. This block was formerly the worst street in the city for bootleggers and speakeasies. They had a nickname for it. It's called, well, the Dardanelles, because it was a dangerous street to walk down at night. Why do I show you the Dominion Building? Because in the beginning, they were going to call it the Confederation Building, and they did. But the city said, don't call it the Confederation Building. We're hoping to build our own civic auditorium and theater and tourist information center, and we want to call that the Confederation Building. And Ottawa said, well, we're calling this the Confederation Building. But they changed the name later. By now, there's a bit of a progression. If you look at postcards, early in the century, provincial buildings, Charlottetown. But by the 1940s and 50s, Province House, home of Confederation. And they're showing you postcard slides of the Room of Destiny. Here is the Dominion Building. No, there's the Dominion Building. There's the Dominion Building. There's not the Dominion Building. There it is. You may recognize it. That's where the library is now. And newspaper accounts begin to talk about, and again I wanted to show you this previous slide, the fact that thousands of people per year are now coming to see the Confederation Chamber in Province House. And there's a commissioner, there's no formal guide, but the commissioner, Robert Craig, has become kind of a celebrity. Scottish accent, giving people a tour of what's important. Here he's showing school kids the plaque. By this time, tourism promotional films all include references to the role of Charlottetown as the cradle of Confederation. And there's just I added a couple of slides to show you some of these. Here he is showing my favorite of all the tourism films, Memo to Mom. CNR had it made in a vain attempt to get people to travel by train to PEI, back when we had a train. The boy and the girl are here with their father because mom couldn't come. So the film is a postcard to her mother about all the fun they're having on Prince Edward Island, and dad who keeps dragging them to these historical things. That Dad, you had to get some history in, even if we're on vacation. All the tourists come here because it's very historical, she says. It was in this room that Canada was born. I was really thrilled. I'm sorry to say Brian wasn't impressed. Then they go sailing in the harbor and Brian is much happier. That's her brother, her mean little brother. Holiday Island in 1967, the narrator. No? Is that it? Yes. Now, You see there's a radius expanding. In the beginning it's the Confederation Chamber. And then it's Province House is the cradle of Confederation. Then Charlottetown is the cradle of Confederation. And by the 1960s, Prince Edward Island is the cradle of Confederation because they want to spread the benefits of tourism all around. So this is 1967. Charlottetown is a small and stately city, except it had kind of a British accent. The birthplace of a nation. In this very chamber, the Dominion of Canada was born. Mechanical reproduction. Charlottetown celebrated its own history and its own incorporation. This is a tin medal just basically given away at businesses. Charlottetown, PI, birthplace of Canada. Charlottetown is the birthplace of Canada. And of course, if you were here last week, how many people were here last week? Take a quick nap while we repeat what Matthew talked about. The period between 1964 and 1973 is the apex of the process of site sacralization. What had begun in 1914 and gained ground in 1939, by 1964 had become an accepted national fact. Charlottetown, PEI, the cradle of Confederation. And we had the buildings to prove it. I wanted to go back to, well, if it won't go back, you don't have to see the introductory slide. It showed the Confed Center. There it is. There's no such word, I coined that word, and if you're strong-hearted, centennialitis. And Matt really liked it, so when he wrote his own article, he quoted it and used the term. So, some of us will remember 1964. I do. Clever logo. P-E-I. And they had all kinds of programs. This is an album, a folk song album. Notice the increase in spending. In 1964, tourism after the Second World War explodes on PEI. There's mushroom growth, especially in the 50s and 60s. Every 10 years, the visitation goes up by exponential factors. So at the beginning of the 50s, there's like 40,000 tourists. By the end of the 50s, 250,000. By 1970, over 500,000 people a year. And so tourism now has a ministry of its own. Tourism now has a marketing branch that has more money to spend. And what was $20,000 in 1939 becomes $420,000 plus $100,000 from Canada's Centennial Commission because they decided to grandfather 1964 into the centennial so that we could be included. And you start seeing this, again, mechanical reproduction, centennial, Prince Edward Island, Confederation dominates, well, and horse racing. That's a placemat. Commemorative coin, I'm sorry to say that I didn't keep mine. All the school kids, I think, got this coin, a commemorative coin. This is one side, and the reverse side, which showed up first. This new building. Here's Province House, and here is the Fathers of Confederation Memorial Buildings. This huge, tangible legacy of Confederation. A living memorial to Confederation. Only one in Canada. The first, and to date, only one in Canada. It cost $5.6 million. And Prince Edward Island spent not a cent. Now that is good marketing. So, a little bit of backstory to that. I've written a book about this, so I probably give you too much information. But it is the brainchild. The idea was around. The Deef was always trying to hog the spotlight. And that was going forward instead of back. Okay, sorry, there we go. Imagine, so Aerial is the brainchild of Frank McKinnon, Islander, political scientist, award-winning political scientist, principal at the College of Prince of Wales, member of the Canada Council, big dreamer. I don't know if any of you knew Frank. I met him only through the mail when he refused to allow me to interview him about the founding of the Confed Center. He declined politely. And Eric Harvey, a Calgary oilman with no connection to Prince Edward Island. But Eric Harvey was a big, very traditional Canadian nationalist. And he was on the Canada Council. And they were in Vancouver. And he was going down early for breakfast. He was an early riser. And he gets in the elevator. And who's in the elevator but Frank McKinnon? He says, Frank, what are you doing up so early? He said, I'm going out to look at the Queen Elizabeth Auditorium. I'm looking for examples and models for this project that we have in mind back in Charlottetown. And we want it to be a memorial. It's going to be an art center and an auditorium, but we want it to be kind of a memorial to the Fathers of the Confederation. And Eric Harvey said, that's something I could get interested in. And Eric Harvey ended up providing the funding for the fundraising campaign and quite a bit of his own money, plus his influence, particularly out west where he had a lot of connections. Frank McKinnon was the talking head. He gave most of the pitches. Eric Harvey was the one that got him through the door in many cases, except in, I believe, Ontario, where the Premier didn't like Eric Harvey and was kind of insulted. So the first thing they did was they had to convince the Premier of PEI that if they could get it built, the province would pay to operate it. Two premiers said, sure, thinking, this is never going to happen, and having no idea how much that was actually going to cost. And then, so I'm not sure if the slides are in the right order. Yeah, there are the two premiers. Then they went to Ottawa, where the Deef has been thinking centennial since basically 1958. He wants there to be a major splash. And so in a way he's receptive to their idea that we want to build a memorial to the Fathers of Confederation in Charlottetown. And he says, if you can get the provinces to commit to pay half the cost, Ottawa will pay the other half. Well, with that commitment under their belts, McKinnon and Harvey enter in this classic case of leverage, meeting with all of the premiers. They have a national board, and the national board is filled with people that have contacts with the Premier's office, and they get meetings set up, and they go in. And the first province to commit to funding an art center in Charlottetown, which would benefit their province not at all, was Quebec. Jean Lesage said, we're in. Then you could go and say, well, the federal government says they'll get 1/2 of the money and Quebec is in. Are you in? And one by one, they convinced the provinces. The final holdouts were Ontario, who were going to pay the lion's share, and Manitoba. And what I wanted to know from Frank McKinnon was, correspondence in the Harvey files in Calgary suggests that he gave Manitoba the money to ante up their share. And Frank McKinnon wrote back and he said, there's some things it's better not to talk about. Anyway, it was a remarkable effort. So PEI is providing the site and the upkeep. Quebec and Ontario are providing nearly $1 million for a national shrine to Confederation located in Charlottetown. We must be the cradle of Confederation. Otherwise, why would we build the building here? And they built it, and it opened on time and more or less on budget. They were still trying to fix, you know, leaks in the roof years later. I want to go back. I want to go back. There it is. There's the maquette on Queen Square. Physical heart of the city, official heart of the province, right beside Province House. Built with the same stones. The exterior cladding, it's a brutalist, you know, design, but the exterior stone is the same stone used in Province House. The scale does not dwarf the building at Province House. Unlike, for example, the new residence at UPEI. Am I bitter? No. There it is, located. Here's, you know, Province House. And notice how they've lined up the front entrance. This is the front entrance. No one really believes that because no one uses that door. And you know why? Because as I've said before, it's in, you know, the Charter of Rights for Islanders that you should be able to park directly in front of whatever door you plan to go in. There's no way you could ever get to park in front of that entrance, so nobody uses it. But the entrance is lined up directly in line with Province House. It's architecturally extremely clever. See? Oops. There, yeah, well, I said, you know you've made it when you make it onto a stamp. I do want to show you the... No, it's just not moving at all. Don't you like getting the previews of the slides you're about to see? There. This is from a magazine, like an architectural magazine. Front entrance directly lined up with Province House. Yes. Now this isn't a faithful replica, but I would like a stamp. Because if you can get a stamp, you've obviously made it in the world. Lauren Kalbeck published a collection of historical essays about the province of Prince Edward Island. There's one chapter on the Charlottetown Conference, but that didn't stop him from calling his book The Cradle of Confederation, and using the painting from Confederation Life by Rex Woods, replicating the historical error that William Henry Pope wrote himself out to greet the Canadians. I won't go through that. There's a rant I do about that. He didn't, but it's in the painting. And inside, there's a pullout of the famous photograph of the fathers. Centennial Light is part 2, 1973. Well, 1967, actually tourism went down on PEI because people were going to Montreal for Centennial. 1973 was our moment in the sun. We had a Centennial Commission. My brother-in-law worked on it. First, you know, job he had out of university. New logo and a mascot, the Smiling Father, who I can't help but think is Jack McAndrew. If you knew Jack McAndrew, who was around at that time, I think he's the model. Look at the expansion of funding. $2.5 million spent in 1973. Mechanical reproduction. License plates. The place to be in 73, which is really clever, until they used the same plates in 1974, and things stopped rhyming. The place to be in 1976. Whiskey decanter. We had two, my friend Alan, the co-author, we put this in the exhibit. He had one in Ontario, but we borrowed one from the PI Museum, and I forgot that the hat is the cap of the bottle, and I picked up anyway. They had to change the condition report after the exhibit. Anyway, I just wanted to confess that up front. That was my bad. Another commemorative coin, which is supposed to come up, did briefly. There it is. Province House, front and center on the back. I always like this. It's like, oh, and by the way, here's how you can get here. You can fly or take the ferry. I'm going to pass over this fairly quickly. Province House becomes a center of, as they say in England, a controversy, because Canadians have been complaining that they had to pay admission to see the Confederation Chamber, a national shrine. And the province was charging admission because they couldn't afford to keep the building up. So you have all these people, writing to the premier saying, I just want to say, and some of them are saying, and by the way, it was really boring. But the premier, this is not the slide I wanted to show you. There we go. And see, Province House is getting pretty shabby. The stone's all blackened by automobile exhaust and ash from the electric plant. So Alex Campbell thought he had pulled off a tremendous coup. In 1973, he announced that they were turning the legislative building over to Ottawa, which would be responsible for its upkeep and maintenance, and would allow the legislature to continue to meet there. And Islanders said, wait a second, we're not going to own our own legislature anymore? We're too poor to look after our own legislative building? There was a storm of protest, some of it quite funny. And Campbell, who thought, he was expecting to be rewarded, and instead people are clapping his hands. Anyway, he had to renegotiate. Our building is now leased to Ottawa, which is why they're paying the $110 million plus cost of the repairs and renovation, not the province. All right, this is, we are getting towards the end. In some ways now, Cradle of Confederation is a major tourist theme, and Canadians accept that we are the Cradle of Confederation, except for a few nitpickers. So what did we do between 1973 and 2014? We ramp up and we double down. This is 1989, the 125th anniversary celebration, where we did the Festival of the Descendants. And all the descendants of the Fathers of Confederation were invited to come to PEI, and we would make a fuss over them. And we would give them this, coin, a commemorative, I guess it's a medallion. A bit of a problem with that. First of all, tourism, there was a recession that year, and tourism slumped. But also, there's not that many descendants. It's not like millions of people came because their ancestor was a Father of Confederation. But as a program, it was a big success. I was on the advisory committee. That's not why it was a success, but that's why I have a medallion. In 1991, the government, let's try that again. In 1991, the government commissioned a royal commission called the Birthplace Explored Commission. Not to try to argue that we are the Cradle of Confederation, but to figure out how to best exploit that, how to build on that, and how to spread the benefits of that out more broadly than just Charlottetown. I was the secretary to that commission, and it was fascinating to see it. It was announced by the premier, who could be very eloquent by times. If we're to have powerful dreams, we first must have powerful memories. And this is the front page of the report. And it suggested, among other things, the creation of a capital commission. Nope. Let's try again. Well, let's just go with this. So we had that 1989 celebration, and now you have the spread through the society of the Confederation theme. So when we turn the rail bed on Prince Edward Island into a hiking and biking trail, what do we call it? the Confederation Trail. Supremely ironic because, of course, it is the construction of a railway that put us in the financial straits that forced us into Confederation. So in that sense, it's entirely appropriate. This is the Morel stretch. You name ferry boats after them. This is a ferry from the 60s, the Confederation, and then of course the ill-starred current version of the Confederation on the Wood Islands Run. Not as ill-starred as the Holiday Island. When you convert an oil tank farm into a civic park in Charlottetown, what do you call it? The Confederation Landing Park. In the 1980s and 90s, if it's not named after Anne of Green Gables, it's named after Confederation. And of course, once again, nope. Apparently we voted to call this adequate crossing, but Ottawa wanted it called the Confederation Bridge because it marked the fulfillment of a promise made at Confederation for continuous communication with the mainland, so we have the Confederation Bridge. I'll skip that other one. That was just a $250 coin created by the Canadian Mint, which none of us have in their pocket, but it showed, Province House. More license plates, birthplace of Confederation. Did you know PEI was the first province or state to have advertising on a license plate beginning in the 1920s? Not a tourist event, but an important event. The Confed Center introduced in 2004 the Simon's Medal presentation featuring an annual lecture by a prominent Canadian on the state of Confederation, some aspect of this ongoing relationship that we call our Confederation. And here's the medal that is based on the painting by Lemieux given each year to the speaker. And nowadays they pack the building. Capital Commission organized Festival of the Fathers. They even had it in September, partly because they're trying to expand the shoulder season in tourism and they thought this would be an event that would attract more tourists. It didn't, so they moved it to August, and it didn't, and so then they canceled it. And by that time the commission itself had been absorbed into Tourism Charlottetown. But another coin, Circus, Province House. And this, to my mind, perhaps this is the apex of the birthplace as a tourism marketing theme. Founders Hall. A railway building which was about to be torn down, saved, refashioned, and renovated as a tourist attraction, telling the story of Confederation to tourists. And it actually did pretty well. It drew as many as 25,000, a year. Unfortunately, it couldn't pay the rent. And so in 2014, it was announced that it would stay open for 2014, and then it closed. And now it's a food hall, and the exhibits are dispersed all over the place. So there were limits. They're now finding limits to Cradle of Confederation or birthplace as a theme. But not before we had 2014, 150th anniversary. There was a special agency established with a big budget. They were, I remember the Premier telling us, if we get the kind of money that we're expecting from Ottawa, you'll get a provincial museum. No and no. This time, 2014 became a series of events. It's basically just a tourism summer. 70-day festival. The most lasting souvenir perhaps are the big numbers. I didn't realize that these actually began as 1812 numbers in Halifax to celebrate the War of 1812, and we got them secondhand, and then we had to buy new numbers to make things fit. $25,000 a number. So I just want to say, if you're in Charlottetown, please go down, get your photograph taken, use these numbers because we pay for them.
They could have put slots in the top where you put in a loony.
Yeah, could be. A piggy bank to pay for, Kevin, that's a brilliant idea. 2014 was the period of statuary. So we got this statue of William Henry Pope in a very leaky boat called PEI, asking Canada to come and save us from ourselves. Right outside a bar with landscaping that goes like this. Just saying, litigation, possible litigation. And then we had, can I do this again? I am trying to advocate the official naming of the statue as 2 Shades of Grey. We're not as adventurous as other parts of the world. 2 John Hamilton Greys. One from New Brunswick, one from the island, both the fathers of Confederation, arguing about, Confederation. 2 Shades of Grey. Spread that around. They even, well, Confederation had become sexy, so it skipped a slide I wanted to show you. However, I developed this slide for a dinner party that my sister was having as part of the menu, and I was so proud of it that I kept it, even though John A. Macdonald was no longer as saintly, and he never really had that physique. Maybe I can go back. They even keyed the steps at Government House so that your group could go and recreate the famous pose of the fathers. This is the cabinet who are posing with your dad. It's not the cabinet?
That was actually my idea. I can't take credit for that.
And there's your dad as John A. Macdonald. He was our governor at the time. All right, let's see what comes up next. This is a little bit like a magical history tour. You don't know what's going to come up next. Okay, so we did get some flack in 2014 and 2017. People were complaining, again, that how can we claim to be the birthplace of Confederation? And the impetus there was that some of the political representatives from PEI, senators and MPs, had introduced an act in Parliament to have us officially made the birthplace of Confederation. And no one openly voted it down. They tried to delay it until it would die on the order paper. And a senator whose star was at its lowest at that point actually intervened in the background and helped to convince an opponent not to speak against or about the act and delay it so that it couldn't be approved in the Senate. And so I want to give some credit to that senator. There was a senator who sponsored the bill, and it was approved. And I actually testified before the Senate, which was kind of a scary experience, as an expert, because I didn't feel like an expert, about why we were the birthplace of Confederation. And I had to deal with some of these questions. One of the Quebec members said, "But you didn't join." And I said, well, Charlottetown is the greater Confederation, not PEI, the act. The act is not about the province, it's about the place where things happen. Anyway, they seemed to like what I had to say. And the act did get passed. However, they're fudging it now in the commemorative coin, so they've got Quebec and Charlottetown on that coin, a 50-cent piece. And now, the home stretch. That's not the slide. There we go. Did anybody see this sculpture? This was apparently a sculpture in Confederation Landing Park in 2014. And I find this so impressive. But you know what happens to sand sculptures? It seems symbolic. So, to simplify our story, the birthplace is kind of a two-step. First, you convince the rest of the world that you are the cradle of Confederation. Then you have to actually convince them that that's something worth seeing and celebrating. And we did that over the course of a century. But then, in the last 7 or 8 years, birthplace has no longer become an asset. First of all, the central icon has been under wraps, under renovation since 2015. When you talk about Confederation now, again, these slides are not showing in the order. There we go. This was once a very popular statue at the end of Victoria Row. John A. Macdonald, the consummate, common touch, sitting on a park bench inviting you to have a conversation with him. But John A. Macdonald, as architect of Confederation, has given place to John A. Macdonald, architect of residential schools in the Indian Act. And residential schools and the atrocities associated with them and our ongoing confrontation with our treatment of Aboriginal Canadians. And so if you mention Confederation after 2017, it's to introduce a conversation about what's wrong with Confederation, not what's right. And that raises an important point. These kinds of anniversaries are commemorations, and commemoration is not a synonym for celebration. It's a time for reflection, sober reflection as well as celebration. So this became that, and then the statue was entirely removed. The Confederation players, the slide, oh, I'm actually missing a slide there. Confederation players who were established in 1989 as a legacy of that anniversary give walking tours of the city in character as Confederation-era fathers and mothers of Confederation. And they were finding it increasingly awkward because people were asking them awkward questions and they couldn't give their own opinion as a young person in 2019. They had to answer in character. So the pandemic interrupted, and when they re-emerged after the pandemic, they had reinvented themselves, no longer as the Confederation players, but as the heritage players. No longer constrained to be in character and able to speak to contemporary issues of Confederation. As we all know, the Confederation Bridge, the province has officially requested that it be renamed Epicwit Crossing as a part of the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation. Have you seen the new license plates? No more birthplace of Confederation. The blandest license plates that we have had in 60 years.
Food Island.
Food Island. Come and eat our food. So when I first gave this talk last fall, there were no announcements about 150th anniversary of our joining Confederation. No special agency, no commissions, no summer of special events and celebration. Any plans for 2023? None, not about you. And what about you? The only outcome is there's a PEI 150 fund which has sponsored these talks with a maximum of $2,500 per event, which I totally missed when it was announced in the newspaper. And I've been trying to find out what their budget is. No one's ever announced it. So the birthplace theme has perhaps had its day, or perhaps better, has reached its limit. But Confederation as a moment, Confederation as an opportunity to consider ourselves as a people, to consider our country, the good and the bad, will never go away. And so I think it really will have a place. Whether it will have a place as a major tourist attraction will remain to be seen. So thank you very much. That's more than enough.